8:13 a.m. on November 30, 1942, test pilot Bob Chilton pushed the throttle forward on a silver P-51 prototype parked on the Englewood, California runway and felt something he had never experienced in 19 years of test flying. The Packard V1650 Merlin engine roared to life, producing 1,450 horsepower. The aircraft, designated XP-51B, rolled forward, accelerated down the concrete strip, and lifted off after just 800 feet of ground roll. Over the next 45 minutes, Chilton would uncover a critical problem that could have doomed the program. A chemical reaction between incompatible metals in the cooling system was clogging the radiator. The engine overheated at combat power settings. Temperature gauges soared past the red line. Any other aircraft would have been grounded immediately. But this was no ordinary plane. This was the combination of the finest American airframe with the best British engine. And that cooling issue, a flaw that seemed fatal, would inadvertently lead to a redesign that transformed the P-51 Mustang into the most lethal long-range fighter of World War II. 23 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Don Blay would prove it over Berlin. The North American P-51 Mustang had started as a rejected concept. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with a simple request: produce Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license for the Royal Air Force. Britain urgently needed fighters. The Battle of Britain was 4 months away, and American production capacity could help fill the gap. North American's chief engineer, Edgar Schmud, offered an alternative proposal. His team could design an entirely new fighter in 120 days, outperforming the P-40 with greater range and lower cost. The British were skeptical, but pressed by necessity, they agreed to the gamble. Schmud delivered. The NA-73 prototype flew on October 26, 1940, exactly 117 days after the contract was signed. The British named it Mustang. Early test flights impressed immediately: 382 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, excellent handling, and unprecedented range for a single-engine fighter. But the Mustang had a significant drawback. Its Allison V1710 engine excelled at low altitude but faltered above 15,000 feet. The single-stage supercharger could not compress enough air at high altitude to maintain power. Above 18,000 feet, the Mustang became sluggish and vulnerable, inadequate for high-altitude combat dominating European skies. Consequently, the RAF relegated Mustangs to low-level tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, fast enough to evade German fighters, long-legged enough for deep penetration missions, but not a frontline fighter, not a bomber escort, not the aircraft that could challenge the Luftwaffe over Germany. In April 1942, Wing Commander Ian Campbellord invited Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker to fly a Mustang I at the Air Fighting Development Unit. Harker immediately recognized the airframe's potential: clean lines, low drag, and efficient laminar flow wings. Everything about the Mustang was excellent except the engine. Harker recommended to Rolls-Royce a radical solution: install a Merlin 61 engine. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger could sustain power at 25,000 feet. Coupled with the Mustang's low-drag airframe, the performance gains would be remarkable. Rolls-Royce agreed and selected 5 Mustang airframes for conversion, a project designated Mustang X. The first aircraft, serial number AM208, began conversion at the Hucknall facility in June 1942. The engineering team encountered immediate challenges. The Merlin 61 was 4 inches longer than the Allison V1710 and 180 pounds heavier. The center of gravity shifted forward. The cooling system required a complete redesign, with radiator capacity increased to handle the Merlin's higher operating temperatures. But the greatest obstacle went unnoticed until Bob Chilton's first flight on November 30, 1942. Chilton climbed to 5,000 feet. The Merlin ran flawlessly. Power output was astonishing. He pushed the throttle to combat power, 54 inches of manifold pressure at 2,850 revolutions per minute. The Mustang accelerated like nothing he had flown before: 350 miles per hour level flight, then 380 to 400. Then the coolant temperature gauge began rising. Normal operating temperature was 105 degrees Celsius. Chilton watched it climb to 110, 120, 130. At 135 degrees Celsius, catastrophic engine damage would occur: cylinder heads could warp, pistons seize, connecting rods fail. Chilton cut power and descended immediately, landing 22 minutes into the flight. Ground crews opened the cowling, steam hissed from the radiator overflow, the coolant reservoir nearly empty. Engineers drained the system to find the radiator core partially blocked with green-brown sludge. Chemical analysis revealed the cause: galvanic corrosion between aluminum radiator tubes and brass fittings, accelerated by ethylene glycol coolant. The Allison-powered Mustang had used compatible metals, but the Merlin installation required different materials, fittings, and plumbing. The engineers had ensured fit and function but had neglected chemical compatibility. The failure rate was unacceptable. At combat power, the engine overheated in less than 12 minutes. Intercept missions lasted 45 minutes. Bomber escort missions lasted 4 hours. The cooling system had to endure maximum stress for extended periods. North American engineers proposed a solution: replace the radiator with corrosion-resistant materials, redesign coolant passages, and modify the header tank. Simple in theory, but complex in practice. The ventral radiator installation had been optimized for the Allison engine. Changing materials required resizing the radiator, which necessitated recalculating the entire cooling duct, including the fuselage scoop, inlet geometry, and exit nozzle. Lead aerodynamicist Edgar Atwood saw an opportunity. The redesigned system could improve performance. The original Mustang I radiator was too close to the fuselage, creating boundary layer problems. Atwood proposed moving the intake forward and down, creating a boundary layer splitter to allow high-velocity air to flow through the radiator. Frontal area would increase slightly, adding drag, but the efficiency gain would allow a smaller radiator and reduced internal pressure loss. The second P-51B prototype received the redesigned cooling system, stainless steel radiator tubes, a modified scoop with pronounced boundary layer separation, and a relocated header tank for better coolant distribution. Test pilot L. Paul flew it on January 13, 1943. At 20,000 feet in maximum continuous power, 50 inches of manifold pressure, coolant temperature stabilized at 105 degrees Celsius, oil at 70 degrees Celsius. He maintained full power for 40 minutes without any gauge fluctuation. The redesigned cooling system worked flawlessly. The performance improvement amazed everyone. The second prototype was faster than the first, despite using the identical engine. At 25,000 feet, maximum speed increased from 432 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour, a 9 mph gain with the same horsepower. Engineers initially assumed measurement error, but repeated tests confirmed the results. The redesigned cooling duct was producing less drag than the original installation, significantly less drag, enough to offset the increased frontal area and produce a net gain in aerodynamic efficiency. The phenomenon was called the Meredith effect, named after British engineer Frederick Meredith, who'd published theoretical work on radiator duct design in 1936. Air flowing through a properly designed cooling duct could be heated by the radiator, expanded, and exhausted with enough velocity to generate thrust. Not enough thrust to exceed cooling drag completely, but enough to offset a substantial portion of it. The Mustang's redesigned ventral scoop, created accidentally while solving a cooling problem, achieved something close to ideal Meredith effect performance. The boundary layer splitter reduced inlet losses. The radiator heating added energy to the airflow. The exit nozzle accelerated that heated air rearward. The net result was cooling drag, approaching zero at high speed. The broken cooling system had forced a redesign that made the Merlin Mustang faster, more efficient, and more capable than anyone had predicted. The accident became the foundation of the most successful fighter aircraft of World War II. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blay hated the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of radial engine and 50 caliber guns, wrapped in a massive airframe, fast in a dive, durable, but heavy, sluggish in turns, and lacking the fingertip responsiveness he'd learned flying Supermarine Spitfires with the RAF Eagle squadrons. Blakesley had been flying combat since 1941, 3 confirmed kills with the RAF, transferred to the U Army Air Forces in September 1942 when the Eagle squadrons became the 4th fighter group. More combat in P-47s, more kills. But the Thunderbolt felt wrong. Too big, too clumsy, nothing like the Spitfire he'd loved. In December 1943, Major General William Keeptainer temporarily assigned Blakesley to the 354th Fighter Group. They just received the first P-51B Mustangs in the European theater. The 354th needed an experienced leader to introduce the new fighter to combat operations. Blakesley climbed into a P-51B on December 11, 1943. He started the Packard Merlin. The sound was familiar, identical to the Spitfire's Rolls-Royce engine. He taxied to the runway, advanced the throttle, and felt the Mustang accelerate with authority. The control response was immediate. Light stick forces, precise roll rate. The Mustang felt alive beneath his hands. He climbed to 15,000 FT and flew a series of combat maneuvers, tight turns, barrel rolls, split S reversals. The fighter responded instantly to every input. Blakesley returned to base after 90 minutes. He'd found what he'd been searching for since leaving the Spitfire, a fighter that combined firepower, range, performance, and handling in perfect balance. He flew for combat missions with the 354th Bomber Escort to targets in France and Germany. The Mustang proved everything he'd hoped. At 25,000 feet, it matched the best German fighters, Messerschmitt B, F-109S, Focke-Wulf FW-190s. The Mustang could turn with them, climb with them, dive away when needed. Most importantly, it had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany and return to England with fuel remaining. Blakesley returned to the 4th Fighter Group on January 1, 1944. He was promoted to Group Commander that same day. His first priority was converting the 4th from P-47s to P-51s immediately. General Keeptainer refused. The bomber offensive was intensifying. The 4th Fighter Group couldn't afford downtime. For conversion training, Blakesley's pilots would need weeks to transition to the new aircraft. Ground crews would need training on the Merlin engine. The logistics were impossible. Blakesley made a promise. "Give me P-51s and we'll be operational in 24 hours. Keeper didn't believe him. No fighter group had ever converted aircraft types in less than a week. The typical transition process required ground school, familiarization flights, formation practice, gunnery training, tactical exercises. 24 hours was insane. But Blakesley had an advantage. Most of his pilots had flown Spitfires with the Eagle squadrons. They knew the Merlin engine. They understood British engine management techniques. The P-51 used American instruments and switches, but the fundamentals were identical. Blakesley's ground crews had worked on Merlins in raft service. They knew the engine's quirks, coolant mixture ratios, oil pressure requirements, supercharger gear change procedures, maintenance intervals. The Packard V1650 was built in America, but it was fundamentally a Rolls-Royce design. Keepton finally agreed. The first P-51BS arrived at Debden Airfield on February 13, 1944. Blakesley watched them taxi in silver birds with squared-off canopies and vententral radiator scoops. Beautiful, lethal. He gathered his pilots that evening. Some had 30 minutes total time in P-51s. Most had never sat in the cockpit. Blakesley's briefing was direct. "You'll learn to fly them on the way to the target." February 28, 1944. The 4th Fighter Group's first operational mission with P-51 Mustangs. 22 aircraft escorting bombers to targets in northern France. The pilots had an average of 40 minutes flying time in their new fighters. Blakesley led the formation. Temperatures stable, fuel consumption better than expected. The Mustangs cruised at 25,000 feet without straining. P-47s had struggled to reach that altitude. The Merlin's 2-stage supercharger made high-altitude operations effortless. German fighters probed the formation but didn't commit to attacks. The mission lasted 2 hours. All aircraft returned safely. Zero mechanical problems. Blakesley had kept his promise, operational in 24 hours. But the real test was coming. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force would send bombers to Berlin for the first time in daylight. 660 B-17s and B-24s, the deepest penetration yet. The Luftwaffe would send everything they had. Blakesley would lead the 4th Fighter Group escort. His call sign was Horseback. The radio chatter that day would make history. March 6, 1944. 0730 hours. RAF Debden, Essex, England. Temperature 4 degrees Celsius, overcast sky. 3,000-foot ceiling, light rain. Blakesley climbed into P-51B serial number 436437. His assigned aircraft. No nose art, no kill markings. Blakesley refused to decorate his fighters. He said it attracted attention. Attention attracted bullets. The Packard Merlin started with familiar whine of starter engagement followed by the distinctive thump of cylinders firing. 12 cylinders, liquid, cooled, 1380 horsepower at maximum continuous power. The sound that had powered Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Lancasters through 3 years of war. 68 P-51s taxied to the runway. The 4th Fighter Group plus attached squadrons. Mission, escort B-17 Flying Fortresses to Berlin. The first American fighters over the German capital in daylight. Takeoff at 0810. Blakesley led the formation into the overcast. They climbed through 8,000 feet of cloud before breaking into clear sky. Sunlight reflected off silver wings. The formation assembled and turned east toward the channel, crossing the Dutch coast at 0903. Altitude 27,000 feet outside air. Temperature -40 degrees Celsius. Blakesley checked his instruments. Coolant temperature 100 degrees Celsius. Oil temperature 68 degrees Celsius. Fuel 170 G internal. 108 drop tanks full. Enough range to reach Berlin with 45 minutes combat time remaining. The redesigned cooling system that had emerged from Bob Chilton's overheating problem was performing perfectly. At 27,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures, the engine maintained ideal operating temperature without struggle. The boundary layer splitter was feeding clean air to the radiator. The Meredith effect duct was producing thrust nearly equal to cooling drag. Radio call at 0942. Horseback, this is Greenhouse. Bandits at 2 o'clock high. Estimate 40 plus. Blakesley looked right. Black dots against blue sky. Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 3. They were positioning for an attack on the bomber stream. Horseback to all aircraft. Drop tanks. Prepare to engage. 68 P-51s released their external fuel tanks simultaneously. The aluminum tanks tumbled earthward, glinting in morning sunlight. The Mustangs accelerated. Drag reduced by 30%. Maximum speed increased from 380 miles per hour to 440 miles per hour. The German fighters dove toward the bombers. Standard Luftwaffe tactic. Dive from altitude. Attack a single bomber. Climb away before escort fighters could react. Fast, violent, effective. Blay rolled. His P-51 inverted and pulled through into a diving turn. The Merlin's negative G fuel system kept the engine running smoothly. Earlier, Allison engines had cut out during negative G maneuvers. The Merlin never missed a beat. He closed on the lead Bf-109 at 450 miles per hour. Range 400 yards. The German pilot saw him and broke hard right. Blakesley followed. The P-51 rolled effortlessly. Control harmony was perfect. Elevator, aileron, and rudder coordination required minimal pilot input. The fighter flew where Blakesley looked. At 300 yards, he fired 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing. Combined rate of fire 4,200 rounds per minute. Tracers reached out. Strikes sparkled on the Bf-109s. Left German fighter rolled inverted, trailing smoke. Blakesley didn't watch it fall. He was already looking for the next target. Around him, the air battle developed into chaos. P-51s chasing German fighters. German fighters reversing to engage P-51s. Contrails spiraling. Aircraft tumbling. Parachutes blossoming. Captain Don Gentile, Blakesley's top ace, shot down 3 BFF-109s in 4 minutes. Lieutenant Willard Milliken got 2. The 4th Fighter Group carved through the Luftwaffe formation with precision violence. At 10:15, the bombers reached Berlin. Flak filled the sky. Black puffs of 88 millimeters. Anti-aircraft fire. The bombers held formation and dropped their payloads. Bombs fell toward the German capital. Industrial targets, rail yards, aircraft. Factories. Blakesley circled above the flak ceiling at 30,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 90 gall, enough for the return flight with 20 gall reserve. The redesigned cooling system and improved aerodynamics gave the P-51 unprecedented fuel efficiency, 3.3 m per gallon. The P-47 got 1.8 m per gallon. That difference was the margin between reaching Berlin and turning back at the German border. Return flight was uneventful. German fighters had withdrawn. They'd lost 13 aircraft. The 4th Fighter Group lost 4. 13-4 ratio that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Blakesley landed at Debon at 12:27. He'd been airborne for 4 hours and 17 minutes, most of that time at combat power settings. Coolant temperature had never exceeded redline. The cooling system that had been accidentally optimized during the XP-51B test program had performed flawlessly under maximum operational stress. Ground crews swarmed his aircraft. 71 bullet holes. Cannon damage to the left wing. Hydraulic fluid leaking. The P-51 had taken punishment and brought Blakesley home. Liquid-cooled engines were vulnerable to ground fire, but the Mustang's cooling system, redundancy, and robust design made it surprisingly survivable. Blakesley walked to the debriefing room. Intelligence officers wanted details, tactics, enemy formations. But Blakesley knew the real story. The first American fighters over. Berlin had proven what the redesigned P-51 could achieve. Range enough to escort bombers anywhere in Germany. Performance enough to fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms. Reliability enough to complete 4-hour missions. Without failure, the flaw that had threatened to end the Merlin Mustang program instead produced the fighter that would dominate the Luftwaffe. Between March 1944 and May 1945, the 4th Fighter Group destroyed 1,695 German aircraft, more than any other American fighter unit in Europe. Don Blakesley commanded the group through the critical months of 1944, flying 500 combat missions, the most of any American fighter pilot in the war, and amassing 1,000 combat hours. His official tally was 15.5 aerial victories, though his true score was likely higher, as Blakesley often broke off engagements to maintain formation or protect damaged bombers. The P-51 Mustang became the premier fighter in the European theater. By June 1944, P-51s equipped 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups. The exception was the 56th Fighter Group, which retained P-47s by choice and achieved notable success using different tactics. Production figures underscore the Mustang's impact. North American built 15,586 P-51s during World War II, more than any other American fighter except the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Mustang saw action in every theater: Europe, the Pacific, China, Burma, India, and the Mediterranean, shooting down 4,950 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter. Yet the Mustang's most important achievement wasn't its kill ratio, it was the strategic effect. Before the P-51, American bombers flew unescorted deep penetration missions, suffering catastrophic losses, such as during the August 17, 1943, Regensburg raid, when 60 B-17s were lost out of 376, a 15% casualty rate that was unsustainable. After P-51 escorts became standard, bomber losses fell to 3 to 5%. German fighters could no longer effectively attack formations protected by long-range escorts. They adapted by concentrating strikes where escort coverage was thin, but the Americans countered by increasing Mustang numbers and extending escort range with extra drop tanks. By spring 1944, air superiority had decisively shifted. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced, and although aircraft production remained high, pilot quality deteriorated catastrophically. A redesigned cooling system that arose from the XP-51B test program was central to this success. The ventral scoop with boundary layer splitter reduced cooling drag more than any contemporary fighter, directly increasing range. A P-51D could escort bombers 1,300 miles from base with drop tanks. The P-47N could match the range, but not the efficiency, while the P-38 Lightning suffered reliability issues in cold, damp European conditions. Engineers continuously refined the cooling system throughout production. The P-51D introduced a larger radiator to support higher engine power, optimized the boundary layer splitter through wind tunnel testing, and adjusted the exit nozzle to enhance Meredith effect thrust. Each incremental improvement made the fighter more efficient. Modern computational fluid dynamics confirms what 1940s engineers discovered by trial and error. The P-51's ventral cooling duct approached theoretical efficiency limits, with minimal inlet losses, acceptable pressure drop, and optimized exit velocity. Total cooling drag at cruise speed was under 5% of the aircraft's total drag, a remarkable figure for a liquid-cooled installation. Ironically, that low drag resulted from the very problem that threatened to end the program. Had Bob Chilton not exposed the overheating issue during his test flight, the original radiator design would have persisted. The P-51B would have been capable, fast, and long-ranged, but not the best fighter of World War II. The emergency redesign produced unexpected performance gains that made the Mustang dominant. Decisions made under crisis to solve immediate problems yielded long-term strategic advantage. Don Blakesley understood this instinctively. In a 1967 interview, he said, "The P-51 was the right airplane at the right time. It had the range we needed, the performance we needed, the reliability we needed. Everything came together: the airframe, the engine, the systems. You could fly it 4 hours at high altitude and bring it home with fuel to spare. That's what won the war." He never knew about the cooling system flaw, or that the ventral scoop on his P-51B had been redesigned in crisis to fix a chemical reaction issue. He only knew the fighter performed perfectly when it mattered most. Blakesley was grounded in October 1944 because General Kapitiner could not risk losing another experienced group commander after Colonel Hubert Ski was shot down over Germany. He protested but obeyed orders, returning to the United States in November 1944 after 3.5 years abroad. The war ended 8 months later. Blakesley remained in the Air Force, commanding fighter units during the Korean War in F-84 Thunderjets, a different era with new tactics, and retired in 1965 as a full colonel after 25 years of service. He settled in Miami, Florida, shunned interviews, reunions, and airshows, and died on September 3, 2008, 8 days before his 91st birthday. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with a P-51 Mustang flyover in missing man formation. The Mustang remained in frontline combat until 1957, served in Korea, and flew in the air forces of 55 nations, some operating them into the 1980s. The last combat mission occurred in 1984 with Dominican Air Force P-51s. Today, roughly 150 airworthy P-51s appear at airshows worldwide, their Merlin engines still drawing crowds with the distinctive howl, supercharger whine, and exhaust crackle. The ventral cooling scoop, with its accidental boundary layer optimization, remains a defining feature and innovation born from a crisis that made the difference between a very good fighter and the best fighter. Bob Chilton continued as a test pilot for North American Aviation until retiring in 1968, never seeking recognition beyond doing his job. Edgar Atwood, the aerodynamicist behind the cooling duct redesign, stayed with North American through the 1950s, contributing to the F-86 Sabre, F-100 Super Sabre, and early supersonic designs, dying in 1962. Neither he nor the engineers who resolved the chemical reaction problem received public acknowledgement, though their solution created strategic advantage. Wartime innovation often occurs not through grand planning but through immediate problem-solving in crisis. The P-51 Mustang became World War II's top fighter because a chemical reaction forced a cooling system redesign, accidentally optimizing aerodynamics at the moment long-range escort fighters became decisive. If you found this account compelling, please like this video to help us share more forgotten World War II stories. Subscribe to stay connected to these untold histories, each deserving to be remembered, and leave a comment with your location. We want to know where you're watching from. Veterans, history enthusiasts, everyone here is part of keeping these stories alive.